Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Homendy, and I'm the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'd like to welcome everyone to the fourth roundtable in our series focused on the need to transition to a safe system approach to eliminate fatalities and injuries on our nation's roads. Earlier roundtables introduced the 5 components of a safe system: safe speeds, safe vehicles, safe roads, safe road users, and post-crash care. We then delved into the individual components, beginning with safe speeds, then safe vehicles. And today we have an all-star lineup to talk about the role of our nation's transportation infrastructure, including the role of public transportation in driving down fatalities and injuries, which I think is very appropriate for the month of October, since October is Pedestrian Safety Month, and today is National Walk to School Day, a day we celebrate walking and rolling while promoting safer routes to school for our most vulnerable road users, our children. Now, if you missed any of our previous events, don't worry. They can all be found on the NTSB YouTube page, and I encourage you to watch them, but not until after today's event, because I guarantee you are not going to want to miss this discussion. If you aren't familiar with the safe system approach, I want to share the principles that form the basis of what we're talking about. Number 1, every single death or serious injury is unacceptable. 0 must be the goal. Number 2, people make mistakes, which can lead to traffic crashes, but no one should lose their life or be seriously injured as a result of a crash. Number 3, people have limits for tolerating crash forces, so we have to design a system that accommodates human vulnerabilities. Number 4, road safety is a shared responsibility among everyone, including those that design, build, operate, and use the road system, vehicle manufacturers, and federal, state, and local policymakers, to name a few. Number 5, all parts of the road system must be strengthened in combination so that if one part fails, the others will still protect people. And 6, which is something new on the Federal Highway Administration's website, is we have to be proactive and use proactive tools in identifying and mitigating latent risks in the transportation system rather than waiting for crashes to occur and reacting afterwards. You may be asking, why is the NTSB hosting this series? Because people are dying, and our mission is to prevent tragedies and injuries and save lives. Nearly 40,000 people die annually on our nation's roads. Millions more are injured, and the trend is going in the wrong direction. We need a paradigm shift in how we address this ever-growing public health crisis, and it is and should be viewed as a public health crisis. The NTSB's most wanted list of transportation safety improvements includes 5 areas that we're targeting to get to 0 on our roads: ending drug and alcohol impairment, eliminating speeding-related crashes, ending distracted driving crashes, implementing collision avoidance and connected vehicle technologies, and protecting vulnerable road users through a safe system approach. Within each of these broad categories are safety recommendations that we've issued as a result of our investigations, focused on the tenets of a safe system approach: safe speeds, safe vehicles, safe roads, safe road users, and post-crash care. The safe system approach is a fundamental shift in the way we think about traffic safety. We've spent decades planning, designing, building, and operating our road system for the efficient movement of people and goods rather than safety. And we've spent decades developing countermeasures and behavioral interventions that are targeted at individuals rather than the entire system. Let's take speeding. Does the responsibility for speeding just fall on the driver who made a bad choice, or does the system as a whole play a role in incentivizing that driver to speed? Did the road design encourage high speeds? We often look to enforcement and education as the solutions to speeding. There's certainly a role for both. But to quote a book I'm reading right now, by focusing on enforcement and education as the proper response to speeding, the engineer fails to confront the role that design plays in the situation, and this abrogation of responsibility is deadly. I agree. Now, I had planned to talk about some countermeasures that are being implemented across the US and internationally to improve safety for all road users, not just drivers, but I'm going to leave that to our panelists. I will, however, close with this. As a nation, we need to look beyond just the car and driver and look at how our roads are being used, who's using our roads, and whether our infrastructure accommodates their needs and ensures safety for all. And when I say infrastructure, I'm including access to transportation alternatives, such as public transit, intercity passenger rail, and infrastructure for pedestrians and bicyclists, all of which can save lives. So let's get started. Panelists, if you want to turn on your cameras. Welcome. I wish we did this in person, and I so much wanted this to be in person, but we're not quite there yet. I hope that when we do a recap of the entire series that can be in person, because I always mean these to be less scripted and more of a conversation, which is so hard to do when you're on camera. So we're going to try anyway. I wanted to go through, I guess I'll go through the boxes and call on folks to introduce themselves. I hope with that, you not just say your name and the organization you represent, but also what you do and what your organization does, because I'm sure that we have a lot of viewers who are not familiar with some of your organizations. So that would be really helpful. I'm going to go in order on how I see them on the screen. So I'm going to start with David, go to Brian Alberts next.
Very good. Well, thank you. It's good to be with everyone. My name is David Zipper. I am a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Taubman Center for State and Local Government, where my work focuses on urban transportation and technology. And I'm also a contributing writer at CityLab. I write quite a bit in Slate about issues around transportation in cities, and a lot of it pertains to safety and technology. For example, probing why it is that we have 10-mile or 12-mile-an-hour speed limits on scooters, while automobiles that weigh 100 times more have no mechanical speed limits whatsoever. That just seems a little bit strange. So it's nice to be with all of you, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, David. Brian, and then we're going to go to Seth.
Thanks, Chair Hamidi or Jennifer. I'm Brian Alberts. I am with the American Public Transit Association, or APTA. So APTA is the largest transit-related organization in the world. We represent all of the mid, small, and large-sized transit agencies, both bus and rail, and some ferry systems as well throughout the country. We are an advocate for them. We try to get them funding. We try to get bills passed for them in Congress. And I focus on the safety side. So I am our Senior Director of Safety and Advisory Services. And I do tons of different programs. I do programming for our conferences and meetings. So we have an upcoming expo. That's going to be our first in-person meeting since the pandemic in November. And then we have a mid-year safety as well in December. So I plan stuff for that. I also, anything that's going through Congress or through the FTA or FRA, I try to advocate on our members' behalf for safety. So all kinds of different stuff. And my background prior to coming to APTA was I was with the Federal Transit Administration for 6 years, and I helped write some of the safety rules and regulations that the transit agencies have to abide by now. So happy to be here, and thank you so much for having us. I know that NTSB has a lot of aviation focus and also road focus. So we're happy to have public transit here at the table as well. So thank you.
Yeah, we definitely investigate crashes and significant events in all modes of transportation. And I can't imagine having a discussion on road safety without having public transportation and public transit at the table. So thanks for being here, Brian. Seth, and then we're going to go to Jeff.
Hello, thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. I'm Seth LaForge. I'm with the University of North Carolina's Highway Safety Research Center. We've been in existence about 65 years and really focus on all aspects of road safety. So all road user types, We have a few groups in our center that focus on different road users and different issues. The one I'm affiliated with, which is the Health and Community Sciences group, we really focus on the people outside of vehicles, the people that are walking, biking, rolling, using emerging mobility, and really trying to get a sense of the broader systems in which these people are operating in, the sort of equitable participation in decision making or not that they engage in, and what we can do, what kind of leverage points do we have within the system or across the system that we can negotiate or move or manipulate in some way so that we have a more fair, just, safe, and equitable transportation system for everybody, including those with disabilities, which is about a quarter of our population. So just really excited to be here and to talking about road safety and to join in this esteemed panel here as well. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks, Seth. And really quickly, if you could just talk for 1 second about what you all are doing. You have your own roundtable series that you started in the summer that people can probably go back and view, I think, focused on the safe system approach. Do you want to talk about that just for a second and where
thank you.
Find that information?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jennifer. Yes, so this summer, the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety, which is a consortium, it's a University Transportation Center, a consortium of 5 universities, including ourselves, Duke, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. We also have UC Berkeley and Florida Atlantic University. And what we do is over the summer, we hosted a summer learning series, which is very much a conversation, not unlike this one, where we invited panelists to have a conversation around very kind of basic concepts, but fundamental concepts like how do we define safety exactly? Who gets to define that? Who are we building our roads for exactly, and for what purposes? What do we mean by human error in the system? How are we defining that? I know, Jennifer, you've mentioned this before, the 94% human error myth. We sort of touched upon that. So yeah, you can visit those, all of the conversations. There were 5, I believe, in total, and all of them are available on the website, which is roadsafety.unc.edu. You'll see some reference to summer learning series, and you can see all of the recordings there. Really awesome conversations. So thank you for that.
Sure, and thank you for all your work, Jeff. And then we're going to go to Jamie.
Good afternoon, Jennifer, and thank you for your leadership on safe systems and for this series. I think it's really important. I'm Jeff Penatti. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. We're a 16,000 member professional association. We're a community of transportation professionals. So we have engineers, as is in our name, but we also have lots of planners and technologists and policymakers and others, about equally split between the public and private sector. We have involvement in the public sector at all levels of government, but particularly strong at the city and county level. And importantly, we have 150 student chapters at universities across North America and around the world. And there we help to develop and grow the next generation of transportation professionals. We've been very involved in the safe system approach for several years now, working through our efforts with the Road to Zero Coalition. And we have led a lot of work in the safe system area, including the development of a safe system strategic plan that we did some work for FHWA on that they just released in the last week or so. And hopefully we can make that link available to everyone. Before I came to ITE, I spent a 32-year career with the Federal Highway Administration. I worked a lot in the safety, traffic operations, and ITS areas, and finished my career as the Executive Director of FHWA. It's great to be with you.
Thanks, Jeff. And you have done great work in this area, including on a consortium at Johns Hopkins that we'll get into. But the document I referenced earlier was actually the document that you had worked on for FHWA when I talked about the principles of the safe system approach. So thank you.
Sure.
Jamie, and then we're going to go to Nat.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me today. I'm the director for the National Center for Rural Road Safety. We're a center of excellence that's supported by the Federal Highway Administration, and we've been around since 2014. We provide resources, training, technical assistance for rural and local practitioners, and we serve as a national advocate for rural safety. We have done 3 national summits on rural road safety, and our third one that we held last September was on the Safe System approach. We've also started Rural Road Safety Awareness Week. Our second one, which was held this past summer, also was surrounding the Safe System approach for rural. And we are currently also doing a Safe System approach for rural webinar series. And we have our 4th one coming up at the end of the month on safe speeds. So we're very excited to be able to help the rural practitioners learn more about the Safe System approach and make sure that we're at the forefront of this along with everyone else. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jamie. And your webinars, are they on your website?
They are. We've archived all of them, and you can also register for the upcoming ones at ruralsafetycenter.org. Thank you.
Thank you. Nat, and then Beth.
Sure. Well, thanks, Chairwoman Hamidi, or Jennifer, I suppose we're going to go in this format. Good to see first so many fellow former DOT colleagues, and Beth and Jeff and Brian. You know, it sort of feels like a bit of a homecoming. So I too wish we were doing this in person, but instead we're doing the Brady Bunch version. So I guess we'll continue with this format for a little bit longer. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Nat Buse. I'm the Vice President for Safety at Aurora, and one of the things we're doing at Aurora is trying to introduce self-driving technology to the world safely, quickly, and broadly, with our first commercial application being heavy trucks, and then quickly following on with passenger cars. And so in my day job, I have this kind of awesome responsibility to ensure not only that our product is safe and is meeting very stringent safety policy goals that we put in place, but also the organization, which is something that we've borrowed, let's say, from FAA to make sure that we understand what risks we're taking and encountering on public roads and make sure we're mitigating those. But also, how are employees feeling with respect to safety culture? I mean, you don't have to look too far in any of the NTSB reports where safety culture is a big issue when it comes to building a product and putting it on the road. And the other part of my team is also is around operations. And so those are kind of 3 big key components for me. So for me, Safe System is sort of all of those things, because we have to make sure all the pieces work together. It's not just, oh, we have safe operations, but the product isn't there, or, you know, if any one of those 3 pillars aren't in line, then we're kind of not doing what we're supposed to be doing. So happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Nat. And some people watching might say, why is Aurora here? But we'll get into some of the infrastructure needs a little bit later on automated vehicles and some of the challenges that you're facing. Beth.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Beth Osborne. I'm the Director of Transportation for America. We are a national nonprofit focused on creating a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services, no matter their financial means or their physical ability. Part of my team also includes the National Complete Streets Coalition, where I get to partner with groups here like ITE and APTA and others, and Washington State DOT for that matter, all on our steering committee. And I also work with the University of Wisconsin on some research in the transportation field through the State Smart Transportation Initiative. We do our work through direct technical assistance with those trying to address our mission. We do research and analysis to figure out what's working and what isn't. We're particularly well known for a report called Dangerous by Design that looks at how the design of roadways impacts the safety of people traveling by foot. And we also, from that technical assistance and research and analysis, develop policies to get closer to our mission, and we advocate for those policies.
Thanks, Beth. And I have to say, I have read a lot of your research, which is phenomenal, including Dangerous by Design. And you have on your website, I think, a really great, if you can't read some of the materials with the report, you have a really great video about the challenges that those with disabilities face when there's no sidewalk, when the sidewalk ends in the middle of the road, or when, their needs are not considered in infrastructure design and implementation. So I thank you for that report. I think it's phenomenal, and you guys do great work.
Thank you very much.
And next I have Dong Ho and Bruce.
Thank you, Jennifer. My name is Dong Ho Chang, and I'm fairly new in my role. I'm the state traffic engineer for Washington State Department of Transportation. It's been about 2 weeks in my new role, but I am not new to the department. I began my career at the state DOT about 15 and a half years. And then spent the former 15 years working as a traffic engineer for a city of Everett and Seattle. So the issue of safety on our streets and roadways is really critical. If you think about what's happening now, last year in 2020, we had over 36,000 people who had died traveling on our streets. As a transportation professional, I think we're not doing our jobs, and we need to do better. In Washington State, we in 2020 we had 540 people who did not survive traveling on our street, and that's what the 10% decrease in volumes over the previous year. And so we saw almost a flattening of fatalities, but volumes decreasing. And so it's really an indication that the roadway itself really needs to be addressed. The drivers, how we design our environment so that we get a survivability, even if someone makes a tragic mistake, so that people can walk away. It's really important. And I'm really, really appreciative that we have this amazing panel to discuss this topic.
Thank you very much. And you're right, the numbers have gone up, and they're going up in 2021 still, which is really a significant concern. So we have a lot of work to do together to reverse that trend, and appreciate all your work. And I'm now going to get you a lot of followers on Twitter, Dong Ho, because I have to say he is always tweeting pictures of safe roads, safe infrastructure, and an occasional humorous picture, like no parking and a whole lot of bicycles parked at no parking on non-compliance. So anyways, I just think your pictures are phenomenal. So Bruce.
Well, thank you so much for convening this panel. My name is Bruce Hamilton. I'm the managing director of the Roadway Safety Foundation. We're a nonprofit in DC that is focused on infrastructure and on finding cost-effective solutions for designing better, safer roads and improving the safe operating conditions of our roads, roadsides, and bridges. I'm also here because we run the U.S. Road Assessment Program, which, if you're familiar with IRAP, the International Road Assessment Program, we are the domestic affiliate here in the United States. US RAP allows us to use video and photo logs of roads and road networks to do familiar 1 to 5 star safety ratings of those roads, and to offer cost-effective countermeasures that can yield the highest benefit cost for doing low-cost improvements based on where the greatest value will be attained. So I'll be talking a little bit about US RAP throughout this and what it can do to help us sort of better understand safe road design and what the contribution of that can be to an overall safe system. But also, just as a sort of a side note, I'm a public health person. I've been really pleased to see that, when I started at RSF over 10 years ago, we were really focused on sort of the engineering side, and that was kind of treated, I think by others as kind of its own separate silo. And I think that the increasing talk in the past few years of safe systems has really brought all of us into the fold. I think this roundtable series is a testament to that we're addressing all elements of this. And as a public health person who's sort of focused on prevention and things like that, seeing road safety in general and safe systems sort of come under this umbrella and sort of be included has been really gratifying to see. I feel like my job has gotten more and more fun as time has gone on, as more people have been talking about this important area. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Bruce. And I hope at some point during this discussion, you and probably Seth or others, if you have, if you want to speak on it, talking a little bit more about how we can look at this more from a public health perspective, but what can we learn from public health? What sort of learning lessons are there from the public health sector that we can apply to our work to improve safety on our roads, which I think is critical. So I'm going to start with the most basic question, seemingly, but it might be the hardest question. And I bet we have many differences in how we describe what is a safe road and how does that fit into a safe system approach. Now, I'm going to ask if folks who wants to chime in first. Again, I'm not sure that I can see hands, or I'll just start calling on people. So we'll start, Jeff, then we'll go to Dong Ho, Beth, and then see who else wants to chime in.
Well, I think a safe road in the context of a safe system is one that is designed to accommodate all users of that road system and really thinks proactively about the needs of all users and thinks about, those two tenets I think you put out up front, that people will make mistakes, right? And humans are frail. And they have an injury tolerance. And so in the planning, design, and operation of that roadway and that system, we have to have those principles in mind, and we have to think about how can we help people avoid making mistakes? And when they do make mistakes, how can we mitigate the consequences of those so that there isn't a loss of life associated with that? I think that those are the basic principles from my perspective that align with safe roads in the context of a safe system.
Oh, that's great. And feel free to, I don't need to pick on folks. Feel free to jump in. But Dong Ho, I think you were next.
Yeah, I think Jeff hit it right on nail right on the head there. The streets that we have people use needs to really serve in a way that anyone who gets into makes a mistake and gets into hopefully not a severe collision is survivable, right? But we also need to think about the context. We need to think about, sometimes the function of the roadway really isn't about movement of vehicles or goods, and that it's actually a place. And so I think that's a paradigm we're missing in our how we are interpreting our street system. Sometimes it's a place of commerce. It's a place where school happens, where there's activities with kids. And so the movement of vehicles might not be the best and the appropriate use. And so we need to really rethink our context about road and function and in that context. And a lot of times we're measuring in a way that gets to that wrong metric. We're looking for that level of service and other metrics that tends to create a condition that's really not really beneficial for the type of land use and the function of that street.
I think that Jeff and Dong Ho said it really beautifully. I want to be specific that the mistake should be the least consequential for the most vulnerable. If it's the least consequential for the most vulnerable, then everything else will fall into place. But on a broader level, a safe road is one where it's clear that there's a place for you, no matter how you're traveling. It's clear where you should be looking and what for. And it's easy to behave safely. It's actually really challenging to behave unsafely. We do this very naturally in boating and in aviation. The vehicle on the water or in the air that can maneuver the least is the one that is looked out for, the one that is generally the most vulnerable there. We don't have that same pecking order on the roadway. We actually favor the least vulnerable and the most deadly. But I'd also say in terms of context, there's really only two contexts that we really need to be thinking of in all types of communities. It's either a locally serving road in which it's going to be slow and crowded and somewhat chaotic. And it's actually the chaos that makes people behave better because they're all looking out for one another. Or it's a highway with no development and very few people and no crossings and very great clarity. And it's because we try to have both in the same place that we get the worst of everything.
Yeah, I might chime in on this one maybe from a different lens and not with my AV developer hat on, just as a John Q citizen walking down the road. And one of the interesting things I saw even this morning, with the pandemic and the kind of the pushed outside seating. So I drove by a place today where they had actually put tables and chairs in the street, in the park, like where normally cars would be parked in a normal year. And they were barricaded off by 3 cinder blocks and some 2x4s. That was the extent of the protection afforded to some patrons who might be sitting there with cars going by, not me, of course, other cars, well above the speed limit even on a 25-mile-an-hour road. And I think, Jennifer, you talked about this a couple of times, even our time at GHSA, about sort of like the speeding issue, particularly on urban roads, being just out of control right now. And so to me, when your question about Safe Street, I think it's also how we think about the existing infrastructure and maybe how we are maybe making choices that we maybe haven't taken a fuller view of all that. So for example, in that case, maybe the mitigation might have been, hey, let's work with the city to put up some speed bumps right before that and right after that or something like that to, calm the traffic down. And there are ways that, you don't have to rip up asphalt to kind of do that. And I also think we have a lot of roads that are already built. And so while I completely agree with what Jeff and Dong Ho were saying about like kind of existing, like building for new, what are we going to do about all the old stuff that's already out there where it seems like, certainly in a city like Pittsburgh, it's built around the car and not necessarily around people.
Just to be clear, I wasn't talking about building new, and I don't think Dong Ho was either. I mean, I think we're talking about how you plan, design, and operate, existing roadways. I would also say that speed is a big issue, and it is, I think, very much linked. Safe speeds and safe roads, which are both part of the safe system pie, if you will. I think those two pieces are really tightly coupled together, and that you really have to look at safe speed in the context of roadway design and operation and vice versa. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well.
Yeah, good clarification.
Yeah, Nat, I think you make a good point on, we built all these streets already. They're functioning the way that, and the consequences is really bad. And so the things that we're trying to do is to change that paradigm. And what we're seeing is that the sidewalks sometimes aren't wide enough. With the social distance, you probably experienced it in your neighborhood, right? When you're walking and someone's walking towards you and there's 1 or 2 other people, you'll step out into the street so that you'll have, or across the street to have more space. And if there's a lot of people, then pretty much you're using the street. And so that inequity of space, especially in an urban environment where there's, people are supposed to be served, is really transparent. And I think that example that you talked about where the businesses are utilizing the street space, that just means that we need to repurpose that street space. And, that one initial step might be to have it, having that concrete cinder block to mark it off. But then there's other things that you can do, like you said, physical features to slow that driver behavior, to ensure that that driver will encounter that space in a lower speed, and then up to a point where you might even use that entire street for commerce during the day, right? So that maybe that's not necessary for the roadway network, and it could be repurposed. So those are all the things that cities and governments are looking at to try to, again, rethink how we serve our communities better.
And I just wanted to jump in real quick about public transit. So I know everyone's talking about roads in general, but from the APTA perspective, safe road is where drivers can feel safe. Bus drivers, buses take roads. So I think we have to think about that as well. I'm just bringing in the APTA perspective, of course, and also just passengers. So I think that the thought process here is around drivers, but there's also passengers And there's also people on public transit, and there's people, bicyclists and people that are, walking on the streets that we also have to think about. So it's a whole system approach, and not just the drivers. So I just want to make sure that I know that's kind of my purpose of being here is to bring in that perspective. And I just want to kind of reiterate that as well. So looking at everybody's safety throughout the transportation network.
If I could say a few words real quick, I think one of and this has been sort of touched on, I think, by everybody in some way, but, the idea of positive protection and actually having, crash barriers, attenuators, and things that make these reducing conflict points. We can rely on people to make the right decisions or be error-free, but that's never going to get us where we need to be. We actually need to have some real physical barriers so that, as Beth was saying, not only do people sort of know where they need to be, but where they need to be is protected. And I think one of the things that we like to talk about, in IRAP is, if you heard about, let's say, a roof deck party that somebody had and somebody, fell off the roof deck. If there hadn't been a railing or something, you would be going after the landlord or the building inspector. It's not enough to put signs on a rooftop bar or restaurant and say, oh, please don't stand too close to the edge, or, please don't have too many gin and tonics and let yourself fall off. There are actually building codes that, mandate railings of a certain height. And we don't have that in the road system. If somebody runs off the road, even if they're doing something stupid or make a mistake, as Chair Homendy started, that should not be a fatal or a life-changing mistake. And yet all too often we're willing to say, oh, well, they ran off the road, hit a tree. And we really need to talk about, simple, low cost things that we can do here and now. I know that the Road to Zero Coalition talks about doubling down on what works. I think that's absolutely right. And I wanted to get that point in, that we really, I think, need to take a broader view that echoes more of what we expect in our building codes and other areas of sort of civic and safety life, and apply it to our road networks and not always just focus on driver error.
And I wanted to jump in real quick and give a rural perspective too. Beth gave an example of two different types of roadways. And one of the challenges we see in rural is when those two types of roadways are the same roadway and they collapse together. And so that main highway then becomes the center of town, and the speed limit has dropped, but nothing else has changed. And so in a safe rural road, that would look like changing that context, as everyone has talked about here, and putting in those low-cost countermeasures and making sure that not only does the speed drop, but we realize as a driver that there are different uses now. The context has changed of the road, and we see some of those things such as on-street parking and curb extensions and mid-block crosswalks and things where we know there's different uses now. And so some of those can help as well in the rural area when those two great examples that Beth gave come together as one.
Jamie, I just recently was on a state road where the speed limit changed 7 times and the design changed 0 times. I know exactly what you mean.
I'll just say, just to jump in, I love this conversation. We could talk about this all day, right? I mean, this is what we bother people not in our field with, right, at the dinner table. But I love it because this really relates to a couple of things. During our summer learning series, we had Jan Thues from the Netherlands with us to talk about human error, and he's sort of the progenitor of what we've often heard, right, is the self-explaining roadway, with the understanding that you intuitively know how to behave, what to do, what's appropriate in certain contexts, right? What's nice about it is it's sort of a strengths-based perspective, knowing that humans are actually really good at pattern recognition, and that we don't really give ourselves enough credit for that. We often talk about deficiencies of humans, right? Oh, they can't do this, they're weak, they're vulnerable, which is true. But there's also, we're quite powerful in a lot of ways, and we differentiate from other species. But not only that, you have from the micro scale of like self-explaining roadways, which everyone should be, which means, of course, we need to integrate transportation with our surrounding land uses and purposes, right? We need to know what exactly the street is inviting us to do, no matter our mode, no matter our ability. But also looking across the entire network, because we know that determines how fast we're going to be going through certain roadways, right? When we have disconnected streets, we tend to try to make up time. Drivers tend to do that, right? That's why we see a lot of speeding in more suburban areas where the roads are disconnected. Our colleagues in Australia have actually developed a framework for this. They call it movement in place. You might be familiar with this, where they speak about a lot of the things we've been talking about, right? It's like we have to discern as a culture, as a community, what exactly where do we want movement of efficient goods? Because we do need some efficiencies in our system, but we don't want that at cross purposes with access, right? Equitable access for everybody. Where do we want place? Like Dungo was saying, we should stamp that out. We should really decide as a community where we want these things, plan accordingly. In fact, we've gone so far at our center to really try to champion the idea that land development, transportation should be integrated totally, because we need to start talking about these things as interdependent.
I feel like we're all in violent agreement on everything right now, which is kind of boring. So I thought maybe I would lob a little grenade in here and go back to what Beth was saying, actually. Like, Beth, you were saying you're on a state road where the speed limit changed 6 times over a period of how long it was? You're nodding. So
it was over maybe 50 miles. I mean, it was I spent a long time on this roadway, but yeah.
So fun fact, like, let's say that you're driving along at the speed limit and then so you missed the speed limit change, but now you're actually over the speed limit because the speed limit went down, but the road design didn't change. So you're continuing on at the speed you were before. And now let's say you're in a crash and the police come by, and guess what? Guess whose fault it was that crash happened? Oh, it's human error. 94, that we have, our very own federal government tells us 94% of crashes are due to human error, not, of course, to the road designers who failed to actually guide behavior to reflect the law or the rules around the road. So I just want to give a shout out to what I think is one of the stupidest and most destructive statistics to come out of our federal government around transportation for a long time. The idea that supposedly, we hear this all the time, especially in autonomous vehicle discussions, the idea, which is so deeply flawed, that 94% of crashes are due to human error. It's not true at all. And I'm curious if anyone wants to argue with me about that.
I want to argue with you, unfortunately. I mean, not against you, but on your side. The study that they rely on is from the 1970s. That alone is pitiful. But more recent studies point to the cause of the human error being either real confusion on where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to do based on bad signage, based on bad design. And also, for those of you that, are design nerds and like to listen to things like 99% Invisible, the design communicates to you most of what you need to know most of the time. If we were making conscious decisions at every point in our drive, when we arrived where we were going, we'd be exhausted. We'd need a nap. We would have burnt off all the sugar for the day. So most of our decisions are kind of that automatic decision making you make as you're walking. And when you design a road to be wide and straight and few crossings and broad and all the buildings far back, what the driver perceives is not only is that a highway, but that there won't be things like people. So a phenomenon called inattentional blindness occurs, where they might see a pedestrian, but they don't register that person is there because they're not supposed to be there in that design. And it really is extraordinary. Human error is caused by the design, but somehow we have insulated ourselves in the transportation industry from any blame for even the things we cause. And it really interferes with the deployment of AVs too. I've been watching some of the videos of testing of AVs, and a lot of times where the AVs get confused, I get confused too, because it's really confusing. And so, really, even for the deployment of the new technology, if we just have clearer design, almost everything would work better.
I wanted to respond back a little bit on our profession, which we strive for uniformity and clarity on how a driver encounters the street and the highway. And we did do a really phenomenal job in creating a uniform and very, it's like you might forget, like after about an hour, it's like, how did I get here? Because you zone out because it's so intuitive on how you use that street. And when you come to like you said, a rural town center, it's like you're in that and you have to change your speed. And so it's really about that design cue, changing the roadway characteristics so that the driver behaves the way you want on that context. And there's lots of tools now that ITE and our design professionals have developed that has great data behind it. For example, on that intersection, typically our solution has been, if the volumes gets too high and you get enough pedestrians, you put in maybe a traffic light or a traffic signal light or a different traffic control. If you wanted to change behavior, you put in a physical change at the location. So if that's a crosswalk and you want people to pay attention, prior to that, you might put in a vertical element, narrow the things down, right? Put trees, all those contexts. But those are all, again, new features. It's going to cost money. When you're deciding on that intersection, you can do a roundabout. So it's a rural location. You physically have to slow down to navigate the intersection. So what does that say to the driver? If you go 60, you're going to hit the roundabout and you're not going to make it, right? So that design cue is right there. To navigate it, you're going to 15. And now you create a focus, like your situation has changed. There's something different here. And now you can do all the elements. And so our design perspective and our how we develop our streets, it's almost a chicken and egg thing. We have to say, like, this is what we want drivers to behave. That's our target speed. We want people to go 15 in here at this location. So we have to make that decision. In this context, that's the target we want. We're going to have people encounter, so we want that physical speed. And now, right after the roundabout, we could do all the craziest things that you're talking about, right? So we can have really narrow lanes. We could have all the activities. We could have trees in the middle. And people will encounter at a speed that they're going to make a mistake. It's going to be a minor fender bender, right? And so these are tools that are available to us. We can use these tools. They're safe, they're effective, and we need to deploy it broadly throughout our nation.
Dong-Ho, you had a couple of pictures about what you're talking about. Did you want to show those now, or do you want to wait? I'll leave that up to you.
Sure, I'll
it's up to you.
Let me.
I think we have them.
I think Stephanie had them, Dong-Ho.
Okay. Yeah. If you could pull those up. So what we're talking about is the roadway and the function, right? So this is the street typology and the place and the type of elements that we could put in, right? So on the higher end, the principal arterial, these are the larger roadways that's going to carry more of the traffic and goods. And then to the bottom are the residential, more of the neighborhood context. And so to the right, you see the target speed. These are the speeds that we want to design and engineer towards. So once we decide that, we as a profession can put in the elements, right? We can put the traffic circles, we could put the raised crosswalks. And when things are a little bit more like the minor arterials and collectors where there's more activity, then you separate the modes so that there's place for people. There's a buffer from where people are riding their bikes and where the vehicle spaces. And then on the principal arterials, you definitely need to separate. And you also want to ensure that when there's conflicts, that things are separated by time. So at the intersections, when the turnings are happening, you want that left turning to occur. You want that to be separated with a separate light, right? So that you don't have that conflict. All those elements are available to us. We just have to make the decision as a society. This is important. We don't want anyone to get hurt. We don't want anyone to not go home because of an error that someone made. And so this is the paradigm. If you want to go to the next slide. And people always say that, what does that look like? This is a residential street. 60% of Seattle, 2,400 miles of a street network are 25 feet, curb to curb, without parking on both sides. So David, I ask you, can you drive 30 miles per hour on the street? Do you think you feel like you can comfortably go through there on 30 miles per hour?
I do not.
What do you think is a safe speed for you to go through there?
A lot slower than that, maybe 15, 20.
And this is a route that you were, it's like you're frustrated. I want to cut through, and this is a neighborhood street. And so I'm going to try cutting through the street a couple times and encounter someone coming the other direction. What do?
Go even slower and pull over, I suppose.
You might have to back up.
Yeah,
right?
back up. Yeah, that's
so
it.
You do that maybe 4 or 5 times during the week, and then do you still do that after that?
No, I think probably not.
So what is the function of the street?
Go ahead.
Local access.
Local access, right? So you're gaining your resident, right? You're serving the residential area. So this is not a cut through street. And so you might do it 1 or 2 times, and then you realize that 15 miles per hour might be a little too fast, and I'm going to stay on the arterial, which the function of that arterial street is. And at that intersection, you see something there. What do you see there, David, on the intersection?
The roundabout?
Yeah, it's a traffic circle, right? It's a traffic circle. So you cannot go straight through that traffic circle. So what we found is that at those locations at the intersection where the conflicts occur is where the collisions were occurring. So by putting these in, we were able to reduce collisions, right? So we reduced injury collision by 97% by putting these in. 97%, that's almost eliminating injury collisions, and all collisions by 90%. People say, these are bad. You're forcing me to slow down. You're forcing me to veer my pathway. We're forcing people to slow down and pay attention and then yield the right of way, right? So that aspect of it is really engineering our street to the behavior that we want, right? So if you go to the next slide. This is a typical arterial on the right, upper right, that we have all over the U.S. Right. So we have a bus stop on the side where the bus pulls over, and we have an uphill climbing lane where people could pass. And if we determine that this is a route that you want to serve all modes safely, we engineered it here. This is Dexter Avenue. We put in a transit island in the middle. It'll cut through for bicycles. And the buses stop in lane, meaning that if you're on the street, buses are prioritized. They don't have to pull back out again, right? And they control the speed of the flowing traffic. And so we've engineered frequent transit service. We're going to have very, very transit-friendly travel times through here. And so we increased the carrying capacity of this street vehicle by 12%. Transit ridership, it actually increased with this, right? So they're more reliable now, right? 40% increase. And people who are riding bicycles, they don't have to now merge back in and out, so they have their own space. And so that also increased. And then the bus travel time, even with the additional ridership, it's unchanged. And then to go to the next slide, these are the vertical elements that we're talking about, really low cost, right? So this is where a school crossing is, crosswalk. We want people to go slow. And this is where children and parents and teachers are crossing. And if you try to go 30 miles per hour across one of these asphalt speed humps, you'll lose probably your oil pan once. And the next time you encounter it, I think your behavior will change. So what we found is that you can see here at other locations where we put in these features, that high-end speeding, pretty much people who are going over 35, dramatically decreased, right? So easy to implement. And the picture on the lower right, you can see how easy we can implement, even with the drainage in mind. So now you were talking about new streets. No, these are existing streets that you can do with low cost, some signs, a little bit of asphalt, and a little bit of communication with the residents and the community, and have dramatic results on how people behave. Because you're not going to get a 50 miles per hour on the street anymore, right? No one's going to be able to do that. And then next slide. You have to get data to see how things are working, right? So that's really important, critical. So we have to look at, after they put the facility in, we had a separated bike lane put in, and everybody was saying, things are so much slower, things are so bad. And what we found is that, by separating these modes, the left turns were actually, people were making this one-way street. People were making left turns. They could only make a left turn because there's so many people that at the very end of the red, they were sneaking through. There was no time for them. And so by putting in this facility, we were putting a left turn light. So that left turn and pedestrian collisions were reduced by 80%. We created conflicts by that, trying to improve mobility. And with this, things are so much more organized. We increased the vehicle volume throughput by 30%. Crashes are reduced. And then the bike ridership dramatically improved. And so these are the things that we really have to do to change that paradigm throughout our nation.
Can I add one little interesting observation, Dong Ho, about what you're pointing out here? I think it's an interesting point, particularly when you point out the cycling impact, that, you know, if you make a road safer, I don't know if you would actually induce more driving that way from automobiles. If you, like, transit's already very safe. I'm not sure it's really relevant if you make buses safer than they already are. They're very safe. But if you provide protected bike lanes, you will induce more people to get on a bicycle and ride. It's not like cyclists are this unique humanoid species that are always going to be on two wheels while everybody else is not. You actually can encourage more people to use a safe and environmentally friendly mode if you have these lanes. And I would argue this, I haven't seen the data for it, but I suspect it's also going to be the same for high quality sidewalk networks inducing more walking. So there's something special about behavior change related to safety with high quality bicycle infrastructure. We don't have any bike experts here, I think. So I wanted to make that point, as well as with sidewalks. You just made me think of that, Dong Ho, with a couple of your slides here.
Yeah. And
the nice thing about what you're just saying, David, is that actually, you know, when you design a road to be safe for a particular user, it's not like you're making it less safe for anyone else. I mean, these are net gains. It's not like putting in a protected bike lane all of a sudden makes, you know, driving more dangerous. You know, there's a safety synergy with these things where you can, yes, you can focus on the particular safety needs of a particular group, but you're increasing safety for all. You are not, it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I think you particularly see that with the casual cyclists, the folks that will use bike share, for example. You know, not your everyday commuting cyclists, but people who, you know, want that safety that comes from a cycle track or a separated bike facility, and will feel comfortable cycling in that environment where they won't in a shared, you know, lane situation. So very much true. I think that you will bring out more cycling if you provide the facilities, and I'm sure it's true for walking as well. I just wanted to go back and emphasize one point that I think Dong Ho was making, which is, I talked earlier about the important linkage between safe speeds and safe roads. And, you know, the point I would say is it's not enough to just change speed limits. You know, a lot of times that's what we want to do. We want to change the speed limit and feel like we've done something. And speed limit changes, lowering speed limits can be important, but they have to be accompanied by the kind of design treatments that Dong Ho was showing if you're actually going to get drivers to drive that speed limit, because it goes to the context that they drive in and the cues and the controls that they feel. And that's what will keep speeds at a safe level. So I think too often we focus just on the speed limit. We need to focus on the linkage between the speed limit and the context and the design of the roadway facility itself.
Yeah, I'll take it one step further than Jeff did and be a little provocative about it, which is if the design doesn't match the speed limit, then the government is playing a trick on their people, one that's unfair. And what I'm really shocked by when I really think about it is while our roadway system is auto only, I don't think it's auto centric, it's usually auto only, it's actually fantastically driver hostile. There's nothing about an auto-centric area that's easy for a driver. And as we've all pointed to, any mistake you made because you're confused is your fault. So we're always kind of hanging the driver out to dry. And I think about, you know, when a driver's going through a slip lane, turning right and being told, no need to slow down. But then there's a crosswalk in the middle. So don't slow down, but you better be able to stop instantly if there's a human being there that you won't be able to see because we set it up for you not to be able to see them and not to slow down or have time to react. That's so unfair. So it's interesting. We act like this design is pro driver. It's really anti-driver too. We've just set it up where our sense of autocentricity is not, and freedom is based on a system where you're just going to be befuddled everywhere you go.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We set people up to fail and then blame them if there is a mistake. You know, I do want to go back to what David said, which is the 94%. It does, you know, I don't understand, you know, I understand how it came about, certainly. And then at some point, NHTSA changed the verbiage and the crash stats, the traffic safety facts, which said, well, what we really mean about the 94% is the critical reason is the immediate reason for the critical pre-crash event and is often the last failure in the causal chain of events leading up to the crash. Although the critical reason is an important part of the description of events leading up to the crash, it's not intended to be interpreted as the cause of the crash or the assignment of fault or blame. But, and here's the part that drives me bananas, on a different part of their website, it says 94% of serious crashes are due to human error. So, I mean, I
did most of their communication.
I think we should ask Nat to explain, since he worked there for so many years.
Nat, you don't work there anymore. No,
That's right, Jeff. I'm like you. I'm retired. It is an interesting thing because it shows up in the commercial vehicle stats too, and I think it is probably the most misused number out there for sure. There is no doubt about that. I think the question is, what are we going to do about it, right? Like we can't deal with the speeding and the alcohol use and the belt use, right? Those were almost a third, which quickly add up to almost to 40,000. So I think we have our work cut out for us for sure. And I think this notion of blaming the driver is sort of, you know, quite interesting, especially when we talk about new technologies and kind of how they're designed, et cetera. I mean, I think one of the nice things about working on level 4 is, you know, the only humans we have to worry about are the ones that are in the roadway, maybe when they're not supposed to, or other drivers doing interesting things around our vehicles. And so I do agree. I mean, I remember we had lots of debate about that 94% number all the time, basically, particularly when I think some companies were starting to use it as a rationale for why, let's say, self-driving technology was beneficial. We are certainly not in that camp. I don't think you've seen anything from Aurora where we're talking about 94%. We just say our technology has the potential to impact, you know, the 40,000 fatalities that are happening on the nation's roads, unfortunately, every year. But, you know, Jennifer, where are you going to go with that next?
Oh, no, I mean, you know, from an NTSB perspective, if we just looked at every single crash or significant event in any mode of transportation, we could say, human error and walk away. What would be the purpose of the NTSB, right? No, we look at all the contributing factors to what led to that event. And that's what you have to do in order to improve safety. We would not have, if we did that, we would not have seen the significant safety achievements that we've seen in other modes of transportation like aviation. Could you imagine if we took that view after every plane crash? Oh, pilot error. No way. That would never happen in aviation. But for some reason, we've made that perfectly acceptable on our nation's roads. I'm not saying, and people watching will say, well, then you're relieving people of the responsibility to not drive impaired. No, we're not. We're saying everyone shares in the responsibility to improve safety. That's what we talk about when we talk about the safe system approach. And so I am going to go I want to talk to Seth for a second, because Seth has done a lot of work on coalition building, and UNC has done that, and I'm sure many others on here on coalition building. And Jeff, talk about the Johns Hopkins Consortium, because if you look at everybody who participated on the consortium, it's a very broad group of people. It's public health, tribal nations, road safety professional engineers, you name it. And they're on that consortium. And so coalition building is key to ensuring that the safety system approach doesn't become some other tagline for safety, and that we're not, let's see, in 1990, let me read this. 1990 study from a leading road safety human factor expert, presuming that the driver is irrational or just needs to be educated, diverts attention from the root causes of driving problems. I don't want that to be, 20, 30 years from now where we're reading the same thing. So talk about the importance, Seth, of bringing other people to the table to share in the responsibility of improving road safety and preventing fatalities and injuries amongst road users, including pedestrians, cyclists, children, others, motorcyclists, you name it.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah. I don't have to school anybody here on coalition building. Everyone knows, right? One of the things that we struggle with actually is making explicit the connection between safety and a lot of other social goals, right? Around access to affordable housing, around people feeling welcome in communities, around drug and alcohol addiction. We share common goals with so many different sectors, and we're often the ones having to make the case that we should be partnering. We need to be, right? Those in social services that are dealing with homelessness, those that are dealing with addictions counseling, those who are looking for affordable housing, how to develop communities so that affordable housing is actually near things and the people aren't relying on this, not auto-oriented really, but just auto-devastated places, I guess we can call it, to Beth's point, right? So yeah, in North Carolina, we do a lot of that. We're working right now with 10 communities in North Carolina around Vision Zero, and understanding that the only way we can actually do this, the only way we can get to zero is if there is a much broader coalition than what we tend to work with than our traditional partners, if you will, that tend to be the road builders and designers and planners and the law enforcement, right? We need people that basically see where safety intersects with their work and that they have a sense of common cause with us. So we're convening people across these 10 areas and across the state at a statewide sort of task force to basically do some goal and action alignment. You have these goals in your organization and in your coalition locally. Where do we align? How can we work together? So like public health is a great example of that, and injury prevention. I often have great surveillance systems on injury and where those happen and what kind of outcomes you see. And we're seeing more and more of that, which is wonderful in terms of people linking police reported crash data and supplementing and linking with the trauma center, the injury, the emergency, because we know, especially on the bike and pedestrian side of things, right, we have at least half of these crashes are missing. And so we're not getting half of the picture, right? If we rely only on crash data, the police reported crash data, we're missing out on all of that. And of course, our law enforcement partners, they're not diagnosticians. We need to have better sense of what the prognosis is for a lot of people. How is this really impacting communities, right? How is safety related? How is injury also related to local air quality? How is it related to noise? All these things that we know hurt or are in some way related to human health. So again, kind of working very explicitly in the space, what else does safety affect in people's lives? And how do we sort of draw more people into our fields so that we start working together to address a lot of these issues?
I'd also like to point out, sometimes you need a coalition just as a practitioner. It's why things like ITE and APTA exist. But when we go in and we do technical assistance with local governments, a lot of times we will do technical assistance with several governments within one state, maybe from slightly different types of communities, but they then develop a cohort that they can lean on when they run into issues where they might discover that their DOT enforces things slightly differently in different areas, and will bring that back up to their DOT, and then the DOT can investigate whether or not there's a better approach. I mean, just that kind of community, even within those that are trying to make the change, is a coalition that can be deeply important when we're trying to do things totally differently. And then having coalitions like the one Seth is talking about, for them to tap into within their communities, the public health community, and walking and biking and transit advocates and local chambers. That's all really, really important to create the environment where change is easier to make.
No, absolutely. I would echo that. I think at the local level where you've seen Vision Zero plans succeed is where there's a strong coalition of players. The traffic engineer can only go so far on their own in terms of making change. They need a partnership with enforcement, with public health, with the mayor's office, often with the political officials who provide the sort of the authorizing environment for the change to take place and engage with the public. So I think you need that coalition at the local level if you're really going to make change. It can't just be one of those parties. Jennifer, you mentioned the Safe System Consortium, and that was a consortium that Johns Hopkins, Jeff Michael at Johns Hopkins, and we at ITE helped to pull together. And I think what that did is, in addition to bringing together a broad set of the players from within kind of the transportation, public health areas, it also brought folks that represented equity and the issues of equity, which I think were critically important in that discussion. I mean, there were so many things that I learned in that conversation, changed some of my thinking about how we needed to advance the safe system approach and ensure that communities of color were not left behind in that conversation. And so that report, which was really aimed at Congress and trying to influence legislation and funding there, and aimed at, frankly, at the executive branch and trying to get federal leadership in place, really identified three strategies. One is that we needed to look at safety across the system. We needed to look holistically at improving safety. It wasn't just a treatment here, a treatment there. It wasn't just the local jurisdiction. They have to work with the state DOTs, as Beth just talked about. It needed to be a holistic look at safety. That we needed to address equity through the investment decisions that we made, that we needed to be proactive and intentional about all communities benefiting from safety, not just part of the community in those safety decisions, and that we would make progress through the way we design the system and the importance of documents like AASHTO Green Book and the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices and the Highway Safety Manual, that the safe system approach needed to be integrated into all the tools that the practitioners were using if we were going to make progress going forward. So I would commend that report to those that are interested really in a safe system approach and how to advance it, because I think it really has some strong recommendations. There's a whole series below each of those strategic areas, but particularly in that equity area, I think that is one that we have not paid enough attention to historically, and we need to going forward.
Can I ask a question going the other direction, Jennifer? I don't want to take over your role here, but just to, I hear often a lot of times talk about the importance of coalitions and the importance of putting a stake in the ground on safe systems and Vision Zero. And a lot of the time, cities that adopt Vision Zero fail miserably. Washington, D.C. declared we're going to be a Vision Zero city 4 years ago. Our death rate is up 32% in that time. Bill de Blasio in New York City declared his commitment to Vision Zero in 2013-ish. Don't quote me on the year. But so far, as of a week or two ago, the deaths on New York City streets are higher than any point since 2013. So making a claim of adopting the principles that we're all agreeing are important here seems not to be enough. Why do you think that cities, and I know some states have struggled as well, fail to deliver on the promises of Vision Zero? And Beth is about to jump out of the screen because she has thoughts here. But I actually think I think we should be honest about it, because the fact of the matter is, if there's one thing we've learned in the last decade, I think it's that simply declaring your commitment to these principles is not enough.
Yeah. It's not easy, right? It's not easy. Go ahead, Beth. But I do want to say that, some of the jurisdictions that you identified, New York City in particular, I think has been very aggressive and tried to do a lot of the right things, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally agree that they've been as aggressive as you might say. I think that there's still quite a shortage of protected bike lanes. The ones that are there are often obstructed, often by city vehicles. There could be a lot more bus rapid transit, but I don't want to. I asked the question. I want to answer my own question. Beth, go ahead. It's all you.
So we've gone through this with the concept of complete streets, and for a long time we have graded complete streets policies. And starting in 2018, we changed our method of grading because what we realized is cities and states were adopting a statement of policy, but then taking no action in implementing the policy or changing any of their procedures. So we now look for specific actions with dates certain, people who are clearly put in charge, and issues like that. We've also brought racial equity into it so that we're not just addressing complete streets in the neighborhoods that have the capacity and the money to fight for it, but also in the communities that might often be underserved and often where we find the greatest number of fatal crashes are occurring. We know that it's Native Americans and Black Americans that are really suffering the brunt of fatalities and the danger on the roadways. So a lot of it is really emphasizing the implementation and being clear that there are trade-offs. So yes, someone may feel they don't have as much space on the roadway as they once did, and that is a loss for them. And you have to be willing to say, I care about human life more than your perceived convenience. I remember a former mayor of Indianapolis complaining, just as I think it was Dong Ho was saying, or maybe it was Seth, about people complaining at him for slowing down the roadway. And he said, yes, I did. You're welcome. We saved a lot of lives doing that. The person who criticized, it was meant as criticism, but he refused to hear it that way. And that's a difficult thing to accept, especially if you're a politician. But we shouldn't be hiding from that. Once you allow a lot of development and conflict, everything has to move slower, and there needs to be less space for the cars.
You know,
I have two items that I think is really important, David. Your point about jurisdictions committing and implementing, and then you're not seeing the results. It's because of an incomplete network. If you think about creating, again, from a very automotive-centric street system, and now we're revising, you create this amazing, very comfortable, safe space for people to walk and bike, but then it ends, it doesn't connect. And where do those higher ridership people go? They're in the street now, right? They're sort of left on their, so it's really, you really have to think about, like, as we build this, we have to build a network so that it's usable, that it's comfortable, and that it takes people to the destination that they want to go. I think the other is our laws. I think our laws are really flawed. So if you think about who the blame is, if you're on the road, on the street, the current Washington state law, and then it's model traffic laws throughout the nation, if there is no sidewalk, as a pedestrian, you're walking facing traffic. Okay, I'm facing traffic. Upon encountering a vehicle, you must step outside of the roadway, step off the roadway. Okay, I'm walking along and there's a cliff, there's a big ditch, there is a bridge, and I can't step out of the roadway. And I saw one fatality report. Person was in a walker, and there were rocks put in so that people couldn't park there, and he couldn't get out of the roadway. And that person was struck and killed. Guess what the determination was? It was the fault of the pedestrian, because the law says that. It should be the other way around. It should be that in that instance, you as a driver, you have the responsibility to avoid that crash. You have a responsibility. It's not a right, it's a privilege, right? So we need to change that paradigm, David. If you think about Vision Zero, it has to be all level. It has to come from the top level and say, as a operator of a vehicle, your responsibility is not to harm others that are vulnerable. And I think that's really critical conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, I think I want to chime in on that, because I think there's a couple of threads here I want to pull. One is sort of maybe taking David's point of, like, we're all in violent agreement here, so we're sort of like in an echo chamber, and like maybe a contrarian view is it's not a matter of crisis, right? Like, when I look at where we sit today, we have arguably, without a doubt, the safest vehicles that we've ever had, the best roadway designs we've ever had, right? There's not horses running in most of them and big divots and stuff like that, but yet we have a stretch here where we're going to have fatalities at a point that we haven't seen in a decade. And part of that is, I think the public has gotten a bit numb to what's happening on the roadways. You know, we can all give the example of this. We're experiencing this number of deaths on trains or planes or any mode of transportation that carries large amounts of people there would be huge public outcry about what exactly is going on here. How can we allow this? And I think we've allowed the public to think that none of this is solvable. And when we were having the conversation before about the coalition piece, I think one thing that we might have missed over is like, how do we get the public involved in this and part of the conversation? I mean, it's a big part of what I think about every day with respect to self-driving vehicles, because we can make it as safe as we want. But if the public doesn't believe it's safe, guess what? We ain't going nowhere, and we're not delivering this product safely, quickly, and broadly. And part of what a big piece of what we're doing is trying to educate the public. And I wonder if on this particular topic, and maybe David, curious what you think about, is like, if the public thinks that like putting roundabouts in the middle of a road makes their life miserable, then guess what happened? They reject it. I mean, I've read many articles where roadway designers will get the coalition, they'll get the business together, and they put the thing in the middle of the roadway, and then the citizens are in uproar, and they try to burn it down, and they do all sorts of very interesting things. And I wonder, in this particular conversation about safe systems approach, where do we stick the consumer in all of this? Like the people that we're actually trying to, in theory, save. Some might argue, and some days they don't want to be saved, but how do we get them involved in this? And what are we missing, and what have we been missing for the past decade?
Yeah, I think that's a thoughtfully put forth comment and a question, Nat. I have a couple of thoughts. I actually think that my answer is actually two different things: education and outrage, which are separate, but I think equally important in their own way. Education, in that sometimes people really don't understand the implications that transportation infrastructure has on their lives, whether, for example, like to the point about the former mayor of Indianapolis saying like, look, the streets are safer, whether you realize it or not. Good for that person. But also there's a lot of data, for example, showing that small business owners systematically underestimate the share of their customers who arrive via transit and especially by bicycle. And they overestimate by cars. So they get really angry about the idea of a bike line being put in, even though that's actually, in all likelihood, potentially going to help them get more customers. It's really not going to hurt them. So that is to me an opportunity for education for city, for advocates, for business improvement districts. Again, think about urban areas there. And that, but sometimes, it's okay to be outraged. 100 years ago, when automobiles first became widespread in cities, we were outraged. There were massive protests. There's a book called Fighting Traffic that's wonderful about this. Like hundreds of thousands of people that were marching in cities across the country, erecting monuments to children, often who were killed by automobiles, these early automobiles. And then 50 years later, we had, usually it was women, young mothers, who had shut down roads, protesting the idea of widening them because they worried about street safety. I think that's a deeply healthy dynamic, and one that I would love to resuscitate. I actually think you see a small piece of that today, which is sad, but I think actually very important. When a cyclist is killed, sometimes you'll see a bike painted white on the corner or place where that cyclist died. It's called a ghost bike. In a small way, and sometimes there's a memorial ride sometimes as well. I actually think that's a really important step toward this idea of acknowledging that these deaths are collectively ours. It's not just a personal loss, it's a societal failure that we didn't protect people in this way. So I do believe that there's a role for educating people about the realities of safety and safe infrastructure and the implications of it, but it's okay to get really angry. I think that actually we need to create spaces for people to do that as well.
I think sometimes I think you have to do the right thing. And I think a roundabout is a great example, right? You mentioned that, Nat. People get all freaked out about a roundabout coming in. And there's countless stories that I could give you from my members about post the roundabout being put in, how some of the people that were lobbying against it come around and say, well, it actually works. No one dies. No one dies at a roundabout. No one. Right. And it manages traffic well. There's not delays there. It works. But if you stop every time someone says, oh, those are those European things that won't work here, you never get anywhere. I mean, it takes political will, and sometimes that's politician will, and sometimes that's engineer will. But sometimes it takes political will to make the right decision and bring people along. And it's remarkable what's on the other side, that people will embrace it and will support it. But sometimes they have to be shown and see it. in action. They just can't get it conceptually.
Well, and to David's point about the businesses, I think that's a real, systematically underestimating the number of folks that are arriving by other ways other than vehicles. I think that's a really important thing because we need to keep the sort of economic component in here for a lot of this messaging. Jeff, don't wrap me out, but I'm just going to tease that in about a half hour, the Roadway Safety Foundation is issuing our 2021 National Roadway Safety Awards. And I'm not supposed to talk about it until 3 p.m. Jeff's one of our judges who helped us decide these this year. But I will say we are giving an award to the Broward Metropolitan Planning Organization because they did a project in Wilton Manors, Florida, against a lot of local business and community opposition because they were taking out travel lanes in each direction to provide more pedestrian and bike facilities. And they fought through it. They made the changes. They've had notable reductions in crashes and fatalities and serious injuries. And they went back with the city and the state, and all of the local businesses are reporting an uptick in economic activity. So we'll have that on our site pretty soon. But I just wanted to mention that I think that is a really important point, and that actually when you do design your streets to be community spaces, not just throughways, that actually people do stop and enjoy the local amenities, the local destinations. And there's data all around the country to show that you're not necessarily having a negative impact there.
I would also just like to jump on something that Jeff said, which I think is so important, which is it's not abnormal for people to respond badly to change. And we need to allow for people to be afraid of it. But then push through. I actually heard a behavioral scientist talk about that it was essential to our survival as a species to fear change. So don't tell people that they can't have it, but maybe let them feel it before we make final determinations. In transportation, we seem to go from something on paper to something that costs millions of dollars without much in between. And I think one thing that the time during COVID has done is allowed a little more experimentation, some temporary treatments, rather than calling a public meeting and saying, look at my pretty sketch. Can you now close your eyes and go into a virtual reality universe where you can walk around this and determine what it's going to be like? How about we just do something temporary and let you feel what it's going to be like? And then we can decide together whether or not it's as scary as it seems. And that's not always possible, but we could do a lot more of it. And providing people the sort of information that Bruce and David are talking about. We work with local businesses a lot that fear losing a parking spot. And we often show them that their parking spots they think are being used by customers are 100% used by employees and not bringing them one customer. But they wouldn't know it if nobody showed them. And again, we do temporary things. Let's convert the parking to something else for 4 days. And if you hate it, it can go away. But inevitably, that less permanent thing can help a lot. We as communities, however, most land use codes send that message. You will not survive as an entity without, tons of parking. We have parking minimums. We require traffic analysis. Where do you think these small businesses get these ideas from? In DC, it took years to show that actually only about 50% of retail gets their customers from drivers. And only about 50% of people in the city are traveling very regularly to retail by car. That's not what most local codes tell them. So they're getting this information from somewhere. And I'd also say, just in terms of the trade-offs we offer them, a lot of times in transportation, we tell them the choice is between traffic and safety. And what we're offering them to cure traffic never does. But we're saying, let me give more space to the car and all your traffic will go away forever. Or you can worry about a potential safety problem that you may never actually confront face to face. And that's a lie. That's not true. We will not solve your traffic congestion in this area unless there's a big recession. And we need to let people know about what we're sacrificing in seeking an unattainable goal.
Wait, Beth, are you saying that wider highways don't actually speed up travel?
I was totally going to go there. But before we do that, I do want to ask Jamie to talk a little bit. And here's why. I live in a rural area, right? I would now love to move to the state of Washington because I don't have any of that where I live. And so you should please come be my state's engineer. But Jamie, can you talk a little bit, because I hear criticism all the time. You can't do Vision Zero, you can't do safe system approach anywhere else other than New York, DC, Seattle, and certainly not in rural areas, which I don't believe is true, obviously. But can you speak to that a little bit? And, Seth, I'm sure you hear it in North Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question. You absolutely can do all of those things in a rural area. And I would beg to say we'll never get to Vision Zero if we don't improve rural as well, because it's almost half of the fatalities that happen nationwide. So we can't hit zero unless we also improve rural areas as well. Rural areas are doing a lot of the things that urban are. Some of the challenges we see is that there's a lack of funding, a lack of resources, and a lack of people to be able to do these things. But you guys hit on a lot of the things already that help in rural areas. The coalitions are so very important because then you have an entire team working together on these things. Local road safety plans are extremely important to come up with what those safety actions are that locals in rural areas can take. And there's a lot of low-cost countermeasures that can be put into place as well. Where funds lack, they're still able to make these improvements. And so making sure that we're remembering rural and helping our rural practitioners get those resources and understand that those low-cost safety measures that they're already putting in are so very important and can help them reach a safe system is extremely beneficial to them. The other thing I would say is we talked a little bit about getting the community involved, and that's extremely important in a rural area as well. And there's a couple of locations that have been doing great jobs at doing micro-targeting. Clackamas County is one of those, trying to figure out how to micro-target to the right groups to help with some of the actions and behaviors that we've talked about, and they've brought the community in to help them make those messages. Montana has done the same thing with some of the tribal nations, and really having the tribal nations get those messages out for themselves and in the way that they would like to have it perceived with the people who they think are important to get that message across. And so making sure that we're using people in our community to really share that safety mindset and the safety culture that they want in their area is extremely important. And Seth, I'm sure you do have some thoughts as well for rural.
No, I'm so glad. Thank you, Jennifer, for mentioning rural road safety, and Jamie.
I should say, just to chime in here, Seth, not to cut you off. You and I talked about the issue of just build more lanes in North Carolina. That's not going to build it, and they will come. But
it tends to be, to a lot of, to Beth's point, to David's point, it tends to be politically expedient to say we're going to. Because there isn't a widespread sort of understanding that of induced demand. It is sort of counterintuitive, like so much in systems is just counterintuitive, right? But rural road safety, it's huge, right? Like in North Carolina, that's definitely over half of our fatalities. We have run off road, we have head-on collisions. There's a Swedish innovation you might be familiar with what's called the 2-to-1 road type. Wonderful innovation. It alternates 2 lanes in one direction, one in the other, every so kilometers. So they do that with a cable median in the middle. They just started doing that everywhere, and really to really good effect. But we see a lot of, actually, one of the things we noticed is that there is sort of a systematic neglect of rural activity. So for instance, when you look at the National Household Travel Survey, often you don't have very good samples from rural areas, right? But there's a decent amount of walking and biking activity a lot of times in these rural villages. So things like gateway treatments that we talk about for safe crossing for pedestrians, Jamie, I know you mentioned that. Things like separated bike lanes, especially where you have those higher operating speeds, right? Out in those places even. Yes, people actually are using them. And these are not just people who are recreationally riding. These are people that are just trying to get places. And in North Carolina and across the country, I understand, Hospitals are closing in rural areas. So now we have post-crash care issues, right? This is a major problem, and we need people to really understand this. And I'll just say one thing quickly about Nat and what Nat and Jeff were saying with respect to equity and the public being involved. I'll add a little nuance to it is who's showing up to meetings, who is actually present, whose voice, who's being heard, who's being listened to, who is involved in decision-making. Because often it tends to be people with political and social connections, people with time affluence, a lot of times retirees are showing up, right? And not the people that actually would benefit the most from change. So whenever we say the public is actually against this change, say in Dungo's case of a traffic circle, who are we talking about when we talk about the public? And who are we actually neglecting? Who are we systematically excluding from the conversation? We need to bring them to the center, because when we talk about equity and justice, it really is not only distributive, who's getting the riches, who's also participating in the sort of democratic process.
Yeah, this was something that Jennifer and I were talking about actually a couple of weeks ago, because it's super important. And I think it's why, especially in this day and age, right, there's so many places where people can get their information from, and it makes some of these what seem like no-brainer issues to do harder than they actually need to be. So to Jeff's point, it gets harder to do the right thing, even though the right thing is the right thing to do. And to your point about who's showing up to these meetings, I think that's super valid, because you see that across a variety of different issues for sure.
And I think it's not just a rural issue. I think it's also an urban issue as well, Seth, because what we hear, the loudest voices are the people who are, the best connected and always had the voice. And what I learned from my service to the communities in Seattle is that sometimes when you don't hear from the voices that don't trust you, don't speak the language, don't know how to connect with you, and even voice how they the changes that they really need, you have to make the effort to make sure that you're meeting those individuals, those communities, with the people that they trust, that speak the language, that understand the context, and are able to get the information in the appropriate way. What we found out in one project in Southeast Seattle, our highest collision corridor, highest demographic for people of color, highest ridership, second highest transit ridership, and horrific collisions occurring daily on that corridor. And they've been telling us, the businesses and everybody else telling staff that you need to change this, you need to look at it. And what we found is that when we engage, no, don't do anything, because it'll create a gridlock. You're gonna create death to this business community. But when we reached out, what we heard was that, we take transit, and that street is a barrier for us. We can't cross the street if people are speeding. And when we had the public meeting, it was so revealing, because what we heard from the loud voices were people who were well connected. It's like, I'm afraid of people cutting through my neighborhood. And those were the voices that were up first. And then when we start hearing from the tables with a translator, it was my kid takes the bus to school and they can't walk in the street. They don't have sidewalks. That they are there, they feel uncomfortable because they're harassed. I mean, all these things that we've never heard, we heard from that. And what it does is when we hear from the voices that haven't been elevated, our political leaders understand and they stand up for them. And that's what we found. It's amazing that, so we have to take that effort as public servants, as people who are looking at the public realm. We need to hear from those communities that we traditionally have never heard from. And then we need to reach out, and we need to reach out in a way that we haven't before.
Amen, Dunga.
I just also want to point out that rural America is not one thing. I know we started this conversation about rural, and we tend to use an old Seinfeld joke. We tend to yada rural. It's like that stuff and the way we do it almost show, even when we're trying to defend rural, it's really writing them off. Rural America is incredibly diverse. You have forest land and farmland, and you have very dense small towns, and you have all kinds of different communities. And particularly when we're talking about those main streets on rural small towns, they actually have more in common with my neighborhood in the middle of Washington, D.C. than they do with wide open farmland. You know, and when I was a kid, I lived in Ravenswood, West Virginia, that at its peak was 5,000 people. And I could walk everywhere as a little kid in Ravenswood. And then I moved to New Orleans, and there were very few places I could walk. So rural America is often doing things so well that we in urban America are trying to copy them. This is not, you know, and New York would do well to, you know, to make it as safe to walk through as Ravenswood, West Virginia allowed for me. And I think we really write off rural America as if rural Americans have nothing better to do with their time and money, but spend all of it on vehicles and driving.
And I think that's a good point. There are a lot of different types of rural, and we just finished a rural research roadmap and defined 7 very different types of rural, lots of modes, lots of disciplines. It's such a diverse area when we start talking about it. You're absolutely right. And one of the things that I was going to talk about a little bit later, but I'll bring it up now, that rural has done so well is that with the crashes that occur, we don't have hotspots. The crashes occur in very different locations. Generally, you cannot pinpoint one location. And so they've come up with a way to try and figure out how to implement countermeasures called systemic safety. And it's a way of figuring out the high-risk roadway features to put countermeasures in, and you proactively then take that from one crash location and put it into other locations that look exactly the same, where you know that a crash has not yet happened but will. And so that one piece of systemic safety and how you figure out crash locations and high-risk features and putting in low-cost countermeasures is exactly what we hope that all locations will be doing in a safe system approach. And that's been being done in rural areas. So I think you're right. Sometimes we don't give rural areas enough kudos for things that they're doing.
I know we have 20 minutes, so I want to give an opportunity to Nat to talk a little bit about the challenges faced, because the NTSB is supportive of connected vehicle technologies and implementing, in fact, ensuring that collision avoidance systems are provided standard on all vehicles and mandated. But I want to give Nat an opportunity to talk about connected vehicle technology. And I want you to talk a little bit about the different types of technology, because I want us to be very clear there are differences, but then how that relates to ensuring we have great infrastructure. And I know for a fact that David's going to want to talk about NCAP before we leave, which I would love, because he did a fantastic article entitled "The Life-Saving Car Technology No One Wants" in August 2020, where he talked about traffic deaths on our nation's roads, global trends, and he talked about NCAP and the need to invest in technologies and how we could do that through promotion of new technologies in an overhaul of the new car assessment program, which are 2 totally different things. But I want to put that out there because I want those conversations in the next 20 minutes. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start it, and certainly want to hear from my fellow colleagues, and kind of having actually ran NCAP for, you know, not a small trivial amount of time, and actually was part of the team that actually upgraded it more significantly, I suppose I would say, since the program was started. Very much appreciate sort of David's point about the power of that program, particularly in concert with regulations. I mean, I think part of it kind of fits in with the safe system kind of thing. We have to use all the tools in the toolbox. It just can't be regs. It just can't be NCAP. It's got to be all of those things, plus bully pulpit guidance, all of the above, to really move the needle on this stuff. And I think, you know, when I look across the landscape and I look at what we're working on, I mean, one of the things that's super challenging on the infrastructure side is the maintenance piece of it. You know, we're in a big debate right now in the country around what is infrastructure, which is interesting because traditionally we think of it as, asphalt and bridges, and we're talking about, sort of how telecommunications technology fits into that conversation. And one of the big piece of feedback that we heard from state DOTs, as what my other hat I wear as ITS member, chair for the AV standing subcommittee, is around the maintenance of this stuff. I mean, at one point, I think in our driving around Pittsburgh, we actually knew more than the city did about where all its signs were missing, because we would have it on the map, but it wasn't there when we were there. And so we were sort of having a data exchange the other way, where we were telling them where things were missing or wrong. And certainly when we're driving around and trying to, make this computer drive like humans, particularly very good humans, because we're using, CDL drivers who actually go through a certain level of training. It's very interesting to see, we'll call it the state of repair of the roadway infrastructure, and how much harder that makes it for us to drive, because we have to keep updating the map versus just relying on, okay, I know that lane line is always going to be there. And certainly from the concept of like anything that's good for normal people will help us too. When you look at sort of the level 2 technologies, and not to get in debate about, things with interesting names, we'll just say that those are getting confounded with real life-saving technologies like automatic emergency braking. And we shouldn't expect, I think, the public to understand that there's all these different flavors, but I think we as safety professionals need to really do a better job of separating out these technologies, because we actually want people to have AEB. My experience, particularly during COVID, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have a vehicle that has adaptive cruise control. And when I lived in DC, man, that thing was great. I was using it all the time. I'm out here in Pittsburgh, and like, there's no I won't say there's no reason to have it, but it's just the traffic density is not the same as it is inside the Beltway. And so there are these kind of tag along features that might have some consumer benefit, but we've lumped them in together with sort of like safe life-saving potential technologies. And I think the consumers think they're one and the same. And that's something that we have to address, particularly as, the conversation starts around upgrading NCAP. And I think the other thing I would say is, we always have to remember this stuff takes decades. It takes, IHS did a really great study not too long ago, and they keep refreshing it, that it takes a single piece of technology about 20 to 25 years to actually penetrate the fleet. And so when we look at this horizon that we're on, even the horizon that we're on in developing self-driving technology, like, this is a long road. So we're going to have this, we'll call it messy situation, where we're going to have vehicles that drive themselves, vehicles that don't drive themselves, vehicles with no technology on them, some with others. And all of those things have to work on the roadway with, by the way, all these new pieces of mobility like e-scooters and neuro delivery robots and all that kind of stuff. And I think we really need to take a kind of a holistic view of all of that, because we aren't going to build any more roads, as we already said. And we have to think through these designs in a way on the kind of spanning horizons that the state DOT folks have to think about them, which is, I mean, Jeff knows more about that than me, but that's like a 25 to 50 year kind of horizon. So there's a lot to unpack there, and certainly want to hear from, other folks around how we think about getting all of these technologies together to bear on this problem of traffic deaths and continuous injuries on roadways.
Well, let me try to pick up the baton there. And I guess the first thing I would say is, we talked for a lot of today's session about infrastructure, and now we're talking about technology. But the two actually can be reinforcing. I'll give just a quick example. If we're able to lower the speeds of vehicles through a combination of speed limits and road design, like the 20 is Plenty campaign, stuff like that, slower cars are actually, they are able to use emergency braking, automatic braking for pedestrians much more effectively at lower speeds. So we'll actually be able to save many lives by lowering the speed at which vehicles are traveling, especially in urban areas. So these are not mutually exclusive opportunities here. By the way, I think a lot of people on this call are going to know this, that vulnerable road users, pedestrians and cyclists, are the ones who are dying with increasing frequency on American roads and streets right now. That's who we should be most concerned about. Now, to then talk about, it's not just NCAP to me, it's a matter of how we leverage technology to protect people. And And I should just say, like, this is something I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. And Jennifer knows that I've written a lot about this. If anybody wants to see those articles, which I'm going to reference very briefly, it's on davidzipper.com, or you can tweet at me at davidzipper and I'll find it. But the article that Jennifer referenced is from a year ago, where basically I did a big investigation showing that actually car companies are really good at protecting people inside the car. If you're inside the car, they're going to look after you just fine. But there's not a financial incentive for them to look at people outside the car. And those are the most vulnerable. And this has been, and now you end up with situations, which I believe is what Jennifer was alluding to, where, for example, you can get a package that's optional that brings together things like emergency braking and, say, hand warming on the steering wheel, which has no safety relevance at all. That's just absurd. And the conclusion of what I found from that investigation, which led to several other articles as well, is that it really comes down to regulation and what the government is going to do to compel car companies or the auto industry to take steps to protect those who aren't actually buying the vehicle. That's how we end up right now, is why we end up with hulking massive SUVs that are so dangerous to people outside the car. It's why things like pedestrian detection are not standard. And we could have a long conversation about steps that we should take to look at actually changing the regulations. But to Nat's point, that takes a long time to change FMVSS. But maybe we should. Like, for example, the fact that I wrote a long piece recently about infotainment systems and how they've quietly become a potentially very big risk of distraction. But with NCAP, what's interesting about NCAP, and some on the call may not know what this is basically the Stars for Cars program. You get like 1 through 5 stars, although really you get all 5 stars now everybody gets 5 stars. 5 for you, 5 for you, 5 for you. It's really been great inflation like nuts, but basically it's meant to be a way it's a consumer information program about the relative safety of automobiles. And it was created by a woman named Joan Claybrook about, I guess now 40 years ago within NHTSA. And it was the first in the world, by the way. America was truly leading the world in its NCAP program. And then we just gave up. We have not revised it the way that Europeans and Japanese and Australians have, to take into account pedestrian detection or bicyclist detection or all these other elements. Now, driver monitoring systems in Europe are going to be part of it. Nowhere on the radar screen of the American NCAP program, which has gone from being the best in the world to being, in my view, a national safety embarrassment. And it's something that we could actually fix a lot faster than the actual rules, because this is simply consumer education. And if NHTSA decided it wanted to, it could go through a much, much faster process to update those policies, educate consumers about what is possible around safety within the vehicle, and in so doing, in my view at least, and I'm not the only one by far, compel automakers to very quickly make changes that would help reduce the growing number of traffic fatalities, especially among vulnerable road users. I'm not going to go on now because I know we're short on time, but again, I'm more than happy to talk to people more about this because I care a lot about it and I'm always interested in learning more. And you can, like I said, just tweet at me or whatever, and I'll welcome it. Pause there. Jennifer, did I hit what you wanted me to?
Fantastic. And I mean, this is an issue too, and I'm going to go to you, Brian. This is also an issue, Nat, in your work with MAD. You're on the board of MAD, and they're very focused on the need for driver monitoring and for technology that could end impairment. But we could be doing those things right now, and we're not. But other countries are beating us. So, Brian, I do want to go to you.
Yeah, I just want to bring in the transit perspective on this too. So there are collision avoidance systems for bus and rail as well out there. And they're in the very early stages. A lot of research still needs to be done on them. They've used them in Europe in a lot of their streetcar systems. We've given awards out to some of the agencies that have implemented them, MBTA, SEPTA is a few. But just wanted to bring that up because left-hand turns in front of light rail systems is a huge part of the accidents that occur for transit. And so if you think about it, when they're turning left-hand turns in a vehicle in front of a light rail system, that is happens quite often in a lot of systems throughout the country. So when you have these collision avoidance systems in place, it keeps a lot of these accidents from occurring and warns the driver and such. So it's not just in vehicles, but it's also on trains and in buses as well. So.
And commercial motor vehicles on our roads as well.
Yes.
David, were you saying something? I don't know. You're okay. I saw a mute and then an unmute. Brian, I do wanna let you give some parting thoughts on transit. How we get people to trains, buses, public transit in general, and how you're working with states to increase the use of public transit. I drove my vehicle to work maybe an hour and a half every day for a number of years, mainly because of my hours. And during the, shutdown and max telework, I just realized I'm never going back to doing that again. So now I take the commuter rail system to and from work, and I love it. So how do we get other people to realize, the benefits of transit, including rail, and advance sort of a modal shift across the U.S.?
So I think I've really enjoyed a lot of this conversation. Dong Ho in the beginning showed the project where there was the bike lane and the BRT project that came in, and then the 40% increase in transit because of that. So I really liked hearing about that. Also, people talked about, when parking is taken out, that doesn't necessarily mean that businesses are going to lose business because of that. So I also really liked hearing about that. So I think that people need to realize, and I'm just reiterating basically what a lot of people have said already, but just because you put in a transit system or just because you increase transit, it doesn't mean that your business is going to go down. It could increase. And I think a lot of people living in the DC area, myself, we have wonderful transit. My spouse and I only have one car that we take, when we need to, and I take transit as much as I possibly can. So I think if we build cities to be in a very effective way so that people can actually take transit and feel safe doing so, people will actually pick up and actually take transit to where they need to go. So I think a lot of what people have said throughout this conversation has been really effective and really transit positive in the discussion. So I think we just need to make sure transit's safe and make sure that we have a lot of access to transit throughout the country.
And I would say a lot of that making transit appealing is the very safety issues we've been talking about from the beginning. I'm always amazed that the way we get communities to consider safety and walkability is first we invest in transit, and then we puzzle over this first last mile question. And what that means is we built transit without caring about whether or not people could reach it or not. And what we need to start with is walkable communities where destinations are reasonably close to you. So that's a land use issue and it's a transportation design issue. The way we design our roadways will dictate land uses. No one's building a beautiful cafe with outdoor seating beside a highway. And no one's building a massive setback Walmart by a main street. So a lot of what we do with our roadway design dictates land use, but local communities that care about this are not designing their communities to put everything that people need as far away from where they live as humanly possible. And so when we build that safety and walkability in the community and easy destinations clustered in a place, transit works beautifully and it's natural for people to take. I made the mistake because I had to listen in on a phone call recently while I picked up my son from school downtown in DC, and it took us 45 minutes to get home. I live 2 miles away.
Yeah.
And then the next day I picked him up and we took the Green Line home and it took me 12 minutes. That's because there's clustered things by me and there's clustered things by him. And it's super easy to walk around there. So all of what we're talking about, that design of the roadway, that's the fundamental building block to make all kinds of other alternatives possible, like scooters and such things. And it also creates an environment where you invest very much in those existing communities and in the infrastructure that's there, and you give clarity for that technology build out as well.
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of talk among, like, say, micro transit, some of these companies investing in that, about the first mile, last mile connection. Some of the audience, I'm sure, will be familiar with that term. The fact that's kind of like a lot of smoke and mirrors in my view, because the data is very clear. 90% plus, well over 90% of people, their way of getting to or from transit is their own 2 feet. It's all about sidewalks and walkable spaces very close to transit stops. And by the way, like, we have as a country, for some reason, decided in many places that while the roads and streets are a public responsibility of maintenance and construction, the sidewalks are the responsibility of the abutting property holder. So you end up with bad networks, gaps in the network, some things are falling apart, and we massively underfund sidewalk construction. If we can put money into that, we're enabling transit to succeed as well, because every transit rider is a pedestrian at some point before and after they're actually on their journey in the vehicle.
Thank you, David. I think that's the key. It's like we have not recognized people's basic transportation, which is walking, as a legitimate mode. We have to do that as a nation. We have to do that as a society. That, you know, that should be prioritized. We have to build that walking facility, maintain it, operate it just like we do for vehicles. We have to do that as a nation. Thank you.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. And as I suspected, I could continue on for another 2, 4, 6 hours. But I just thank you all. This was a fantastic group. I mean, like I said, I started saying all-star panel, and that is truly what this is. I really thank you all for the discussion. I hope our viewers really enjoyed the conversation. Our next one will be on safe road users, and that will be held on November 10th. We're then going to move to post-crash care, and then I want to have a wrap-up at some point where I'm sure I'm going to be inviting folks back, but I'm hoping we can do that in person. We'll see. Thank you all. If there, we're over time, but if there's any parting thoughts, feel free.
So I have one. So
yeah.
Easiest thing. So Jeff mentioned that changing signs doesn't get results. We actually found it opposite. So in Seattle, we just changed signs, reduced everything by 5 miles per hour from 30 to 25. And what we found is that increasing the number of signs, they're typically a mile and a half apart. We put it every quarter mile, right? And this was like just that for a number of different arterials through the city. And what we found is that people who were driving 40 plus miles per hour were reduced by 54%, just with signs. Injury collisions were reduced by 18%. All crashes are reduced by 22%, just with signs. So it is effective in certain contexts. So don't dismiss that. And that's, that is a easy tool, just increasing the density of signs.
And to brag on Washington even further, we just worked with 3 communities, smaller communities in Washington State, to do demonstration projects for safety. And they, with really just paint and maybe some planters and things like that, we're talking about $20,000 investments here, we're able to see major decreases in speed over a very short period of time. This is so achievable, and with very low cost, very quick fixes, we could see some big changes quickly. This is within our reach.
All right. Anyone else?
I just want to exclamation point what Beth said. Honestly, we're doing this for people, right? And we've done a lot of surveys. People want these things. The community wants safe, accessible, equitable communities. They do. This is that we've been hearing from groups who are not representative of the community, kind of driving policy. This is what people want. We're actually doing a study right now around pluralistic ignorance, which is that very belief that my belief is different from everyone else's. We're finding that that's probably the case in transportation, that what you want, what is safe communities, well, a lot of other people want that too. So let's just keep that in mind, right? Like, this is what people want. Let's center the people who stand to benefit the most. Let's center their voices in this.
I might just offer, if you want an example of a community that I think has done it very well, is to look at Fremont, California. We gave them our 2021 Transportation Safety Achievement Award from ITE, and they did a lot of what Beth talked about. They started with paint and quick build improvements, no staff, no new budget. And, you know, currently they have a death rate of 2.1 per 100,000 population, while California is about 9 and the US is 11. And they reduced crashes by 45% through a lot of what we're talking about. They narrowed roadways, they lowered speed limits, they installed technology. They really did it holistically. They took a systemic safety approach. So I would commend Fremont, California as a great example.
Great panel. Great panel. I think if I were to leave with anything, it's kind of all the above. We should leave no tool unused, and keep in mind that we have a pretty bright future ahead of us, and we got to make all this work together in a safe way.
Fantastic. Jamie, Brian, David, anything?
No, I'm just going to reiterate the one point I made before, which I think is important. It is not a choice between technology or infrastructure. It's both. They can reinforce each other. And really the people I'm saying that to are the technologists, who sometimes I think bypass the need for doing what I call mundane mobility infrastructure improvements, which Dong Ho gave some wonderful examples of in Washington State.
And I just wanted to say, coming into this being as focused on roads, I was expecting it to be a little different. And I appreciate how everyone has a focus in some way or form on transit / pedestrian / bicyclist issues, because I think that all modes are important in this whole conversation. So really like that.
Well, and thank you, Chair Hamidi, for having us. Thanks, Jeff, for mentioning Fremont, California. We've got 9 or 10 other communities being honored right as we speak, who have similar success stories, who have done great life-saving projects through at least some element of infrastructure, technology, road design.
Which he can tell us. Wow. I think I lost service. Did I lose? Nope, I'm back. I froze for a second. Sorry about that, Bruce.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed what you said.
I said, which he can tell us who all the winners are tomorrow. Can't tell us right now.
No, it's live right now. And we're very honored that Secretary Buttigieg sent in some remarks for us as well. So we'll have all that up on our website in a little bit.
Fantastic.
But thank you for having us.
Thanks, Bruce.
And I just want to remind everyone that a safety mindset is really important, and every single one of us can help get us to zero. And we always have to remember our motivation, and that's to get everyone home safely and to save the people behind the numbers. So thank you for having us.
Well said. Well, thank you all for being here, and I look forward to continuing to work with each of you to improve safety and save lives. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.